The question of how well certain games have aged has been asked as long as games have been aging. Is the compelling gameplay of a title worth trudging through dated art styles and voice acting? Is a clunky, old mechanic equally worth trudging through to experience a compelling and stylish story and setting? These questions, or variants thereof, are familiar to anyone who has spent any amount of time discussing classic and modern video games. These ideas result in another, equally important question. Do we view a game in the context of its time, or in the context of modernity? The viewpoint tends to be related to the era in which the game itself was released. Games such as Combat or many other Atari 2600 titles are viewed as primitive and basic. And only a few years down the road from those simple titles, we receive games like Super Mario Bros. Or The Legend of Zelda, titles that, to many, still hold up to this day. Within the following decade, we saw the rise of much more powerful game systems, consoles that were capable of rendering characters and worlds in 3D. As most people know, some developers made this dimensional leap much more gracefully than others, and it's in this period of change, of new generations and technical revolutions, that we often find games that age poorly. One of the most interesting of these transitions is between the 6th and 7th generation of consoles. Games from this era, whether it be late PS2 titles or early Xbox 360 games, redefined what players expected from AAA experiences. The bombastic and cinematic Uncharted, Drake's Fortune ushered in a new wave of filmic action games, while other series such as GTA and Elder Scrolls were refining and polishing open-world concepts and mechanics on both sides of the generation. One of the most influential of these cross-generational titles was Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed. If you've played an open-world game recently, there's a good chance that it's borrowed something from the design philosophies of Assassin's Creed. Even Nintendo recently had players climbing and leaping off of large towers in their recent Legend of Zelda title, Breath of the Wild. And while sandbox-style games certainly existed before Ubisoft's prolific series, mostly in the realm of RPGs, the very first Assassin's Creed set the bar for open-world action games at the time. But that was in 2007, 13 years ago. The question is once again raised, how well has it aged? Certainly the concepts and mechanics have outlived their original host, but does the game itself still hold up? To answer this question for myself, I returned to the Holy Lands and took a leap of faith with Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed puts players in control of Altair, a member of a secretive brotherhood known as the Assassins. Technically, you control a guy named Desmond, who is forced to relive the memories of his ancestor Altair through a machine called the Animus. The main gameplay of AC-1 is divided between 4 locations, the Assassin's Fortress in the village of Masyaf, and the 3 cities of Acre, Damascus, and Jerusalem. Between these is the Kingdom, a system of roads and villages connecting the bigger locations to one another. The main gameplay loop involves receiving a target from the headquarters, traveling to the target city, establishing contact with the Assassin Bureau there, doing informer missions to gain intel on the target before finally assassinating the target and escaping. Every assassination target follows this formula to a T. Each one can be found in one of 3 different districts of each city, poor, middle, or rich, and when the player reaches a new district, they must climb to synchronization points, usually towers or tall buildings, to reveal informant missions and segments of the map. These informant missions are where the player will spend the majority of the critical path of the game, and is also coincidentally the most repetitive part. Between pickpocketing documents off of officials, beating up and interrogating public speakers, or straight-up minor assassinations, these missions, while varied amongst themselves, serve mainly to pad out your playtime. 3 of these missions must be completed before continuing to the assassination, and by the end of the game they become more of a chore than an enjoyable feature. The PC port of the game, which is the version I played and recorded, included a few new mission types, such as escorting informants, which are really just walking and doing some combat, and racing across rooftops against a time limit, which was personally my favorite mission type. I often found myself doing the simpler tasks to gain intel on Altair's targets, such as eavesdropping or pickpocketing. These tasks didn't sum up to much more than a couple button presses and some dialogue, but I was drawn to do these types of missions more in order to move the story along quicker. Regardless of the extra missions, the player still encounters the same tasks in every city and in every single district, with only a new coat of paint to spice things up between locations. The player is done gathering intel and stabbing guards. They return to the Assassin's Bureau to begin the assassination mission proper. This is where the game really shines, even in spite of the ever-present repetitiveness. Most target missions go down very similarly. The assassination target is usually found in some heavily populated place, a market, a party, or a public execution, and the player will blend into the crowd and then watch the target do something villainous, usually murder, and then have a monologue about it. The player will then be free to attack the target, which almost always leads to a chase or a fight. When the player finally takes down the target, they will opine to Altair about how they're not so different, try to justify their actions, and so on. This is the formula for assassinations in this game, and Assassin's Creed tends to stick to it. The most deviant of missions come from the assassination of this guy, in which his similarly dressed goons spread throughout the city. This is probably the most unique of the assassinations, but that doesn't save it from also being one of the worst. Player may get lucky and find the goon that isn't really a goon on their first try, or they may have to traipse across the city, killing all the other goons that aren't the leader, in addition to every guard in between. While this doesn't ruin the game by any means, it certainly leaves me hopeful for a more diverse set of assassinations when I eventually revisit Assassin's Creed 2. Now, I know I did say this is where Assassin's Creed shines, and I do believe that. Regardless of their flaws, the assassination missions are by far the most enjoyable part of the game. With the exception of this awful boatyard, the settings of each of these assassinations are fun parts of the city, and really sell the idea that these are bustling and lived-in places with shifting power dynamics, factions, and territories. Each target leaves Altair, and by proxy the player, with a little more understanding of both the Templar Order and the Assassin's Brotherhood. And while the constant reminder that the two organizations parallel each other can feel somewhat heavy-handed, the slow build-up to the twist at the end effectively establishes the line between Templar and Assassin, a line that is blurred to a further extent further down the series' timeline. Let's discuss one of Assassin's Creed's most glaring of issues, the Kingdom. Traveling between cities in this game is boring at the very best and downright frustrating at the worst. The Kingdom, as mentioned before, is an open network of paths that connect each major location to each other, and it's the most barren part of this game. The cities all feel dynamic and fleshed out. Meanwhile, the Kingdom is a splattering of forgettable guard towers and villages. Almost every synchronization spot looks the same, and the villages have little to do besides collect flags or run through them. It's a shame because some of the distant landscapes look impressive, certainly for the time, but the actual buildings and features of the Kingdom area are rather drab. Luckily, once the player visits a city, they then get the ability to fast travel there from Masyaf. This addition single-handedly saves Assassin's Creed's pacing. Traveling through the kingdoms is tedious, yes, but you only have to do it once for any new location. A boring hub area is not that big of a problem in the grand scheme of things, but the problem the kingdom faces lies in how its enemies are designed. Most guards will chase after you if you ride past at any practical speed. Going fast is a crime in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, apparently, and both Crusader and Saracen soldiers will not tolerate it. While this issue is somewhat solved by the fact that you can outrun any opponent, going as fast as you can on a horse, the Kingdom ultimately becomes one of the biggest examples of Assassin's Creed's tedious design. Even though running is the dominant strategy for escaping conflict in the Kingdom, there are still times where the player must fight a group of enemies. Whether it be saving a citizen from guards harassing them, bumping into and pissing off guards yourself, or as part of a mission, Altair's blade comes unsheathed regularly. Combat is fairly simple. There's no stylish combos or weapon switching to be found, but it serves its role nonetheless. The contextualization of combat within the system of associating face buttons with parts of Altair's body is certainly interesting. The closed hand button performs your basic attack, the feet button performs a step, which can be comboed into guard breaks, and the open hand button grabs. If the player is holding the right trigger, Altair will shift towards a defensive stance and the face buttons will recontextualize. Closed hand now counters an enemy's attack, open hand counters an enemy's grab, and the feet button allows Altair to dodge. At the beginning of the game, Altair has access to all of these abilities, but shortly after the prologue he is stripped of his rank, and now the player must start with a limited moveset. As more assassinations are performed, the player is given all the combat abilities and weapons they had access to at the beginning. These include throwing knives, which actually are more effective for stealth kills than the iconic hidden blade, and a short blade that is more suited to counterattacks. Most enemies attack Altair one at a time, as the combat isn't really designed for actual group fights. The best strategy is usually to counter any attack that comes your way, as that will either lead to a knockdown or a finishing move. While these moves are definitely flashy and impactful, they soon become as repetitive as most other mechanics do in the back half of the game. Even bosses like Robert de Saab differentiate themselves from regular enemies only by being resistant to guard breaks or having smaller windows to counter. Ultimately, the combat feels satisfying due to the quality of finishing animations as a reward for performing counters, and not due to any sort of hidden depth. An alternative to combat is the game's social stealth system, which involves blending in with crowds to evade pursuers and assailants. Sitting on benches or walking with a group of hooded scholars will protect you from the watching eyes of the city guards, while hay cars can be hid within to give relief from a frantic chase. All of this adds a dynamic sense to the cities of the game, and even though the incognito system introduced in AC2 improves upon these ideas significantly, the original game's evasion still effectively sells the feeling of slipping past a group of soldiers and blending in with a bustling urban environment. Escaping from pursuers is impeded by the game's sluggish climbing, however. This is probably a gripe that stems the most from the improvements of later titles, as the free-roaming, free-running was definitely inventive back in 2007. However, it still stands that the time spent climbing is frustrating in Assassin's Creed. It's not very apparent what can be climbed up and what cannot, which led to much frustration, especially when attempting to climb the large cathedrals in Acre. In addition, most of the auto-run objects found on the ground level, such as crates and signposts, give little verticality to the player, and mainly serve as ways to create distance between Altair and any guards chasing him. This is a real pain after assassinations where the entire city is on alert, and Altair has to return to the Assassin's Bureau unnoticed. In each city, the only way to reach the Bureau is via the rooftops, and unless you want to stop and look for a ladder, the quickest way up is to slowly climb and jump up onto the rooftop. Giving free-running spots more verticality would not only make these sections feel much smoother, but also improve the feel of traversing cities in general. The problem that Assassin's Creed faces is not with its gameplay loop or its broader concepts, but the execution thereof. Social stealth, the kingdom, and other mechanics suffer not only because they're repetitive, but because of the actions required of the player are not as polished as they could be. This is where the discussion of aging comes in once again. I started playing Assassin's Creed way back when with 2, and from there forward the concepts and mechanics introduced in the first installment were polished and iterated upon with almost every entry. Because of this, it's almost impossible to return to the initial offerings of Assassin's Creed and not compare it to the series' later titles. Yes, the combat is rather clunky, the climbing is slow, and the drunks push you off docks or into guards or out of hiding. But the seed of what would later grow into a well-beloved franchise was planted in this game. There's such a wealth of innovation to be found in Assassin's Creed. The large, intricate cities that feel inhabited and realized, the free-running system, and the beautiful way said cities are designed around it without breaking the context of the world were all revolutionary, and yet were still arguably exceeded by the title's successors. For that reason, Assassin's Creed still has value. It's a time capsule for a turning point in gaming culture, an emblem of the change between the 6th generation and the 7th. Without AC1, there would obviously be no AC2, but the reach goes further than its own franchise. Assassin's Creed didn't just inform the design of sandbox action games to come, it defined the genre in its own right for a whole generation.